"We can't go on like this. The Senate has too much power. People are tired of being ignored. If we don't do something soon, Rome will tear itself apart. Are you with me? We must pass the Lex Valeria." Valerius was a tribune of the plebs, and his voice echoed the frustration of centuries. Since the Republic's founding, the gap between the rich and poor was only growing. Rome had expanded from a hilltop city to a Mediterranean power, but not all citizens had benefited. Former slaves, freed men, and the poor toiled under the crushing weight of Rome's wealth tax and crippling debt. As Rome grew, so did inequality, violence, and despair. Landless and desperate, many turned to banditry, raiding the countryside or even sacking Rome itself. The streets were unsafe, and even the Republic's leaders knew it. Rome was on edge. Marius sensed opportunity, and he wanted the Lex Valeria, a law that would limit property qualifications for the powerful role of consul. This reform would open Rome's highest office to more candidates, break the monopoly of the patricians, and give voice to the discontented. To some, this was revolutionary. To others, it was terrifying. Was Rome really ready for such a drastic change? It seemed not. As the Senate gathered to discuss the Lex Valeria, its members were unmoved by the people's plight. Senators were happy with the status quo. Why should a wealthy landowner be penalized for their success? And besides, they argued, Rome's real problems were caused not by inequality, but by those who exploited it, the mob. For centuries, tribunes like Valerius had fought for the rights of Rome's poor, demanding reforms, vetoing laws, and occasionally seizing land to re-entitle the landless. But Rome's elite feared the consequences. What if the momentum for change could not be stopped? If the Lex Valeria passed, who was to say where it would end? Soon, ordinary citizens could hold consular office, but might they demand more? Might they seek to reshape Rome in their own image? Reformers argued that their fears were unfounded. Change, they said, would benefit Rome, not destroy it. But senators argued back that changing Rome's traditions, its mos meorum, could lead to ruin. Others warned of civil war, and so the debate raged, dividing Rome along age-old fault lines, rich versus poor, influential versus powerless. For years it seemed the status quo would prevail. But then Gaius Marius changed everything. Born near the end of the 3rd century BCE, Marius was the son of a small landowner. He entered politics at the lowest possible rung, but quickly gained a reputation as a brilliant commander, winning victories against Rome's enemies that few thought possible. His campaigns, however, had come at great cost, and Marius found himself sharing the anxieties of his fellow citizens. He understood their struggles, and they trusted his judgment. And so when the opportunity arose, Marius seized it. Opposed by the conservative Senate, he sided with the reformers. Through his considerable weight behind them and secured passage of the Lex Valeria, suddenly Rome's political landscape was transformed. New faces with new ideas now held consular power, and the Republic took a decisive step away from its aristocratic origins. But as Marius climbed higher and higher in Roman politics, he also became everything he had once railed against, a symbol of Roman inequality and corruption. His insatiable thirst for power drew him into an ever closer alliance with Rome's super-rich, the equestrian class, who had grown tremendously in power since Rome's foundation. The marriage of Marius and the equestrian class not only transformed Rome's politics, but its character as well. Marius, by embracing the very system he had once helped reform, demonstrated the seductive allure of power. Rome, for all its laws and traditions, was nothing if not adaptable. It evolved to include new classes, adopted foreign customs, and grew in size and scope because it could. A power this great could not remain unchecked. There would be limits, moments of reaction, times of restraint. But the genie, once out of the bottle, could never be fully forced back inside. Marius was followed by a succession of ambitious commanders, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, men who forged new paths to power, exploited every opportunity, and revealed the limits of traditional Roman restraint. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a veteran of the social war, marched on Rome with his army and forced the passage of a series of prescriptions, which allowed him to seize the property of his political enemies, putting himself firmly at the head of the Roman Republic. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey, conquered the Hellenistic king, Mithridates VI, and defeated the pirate menace in the Mediterranean, adding legitimacy and prestige to his own authority, cementing his influence in Roman politics. Gaius Julius Caesar, the most famous of Rome's generals, crossed the Rubicon, defeated the Gauls, and with them, Rome's rivals, laying claim to the title of Dictator Perpetuo, eternal dictator. Caesar marked a turning point in Rome's history. His seizure of absolute power ended the last vestiges of the Republic, ushering in instead the era of the Empire. In doing so, he shattered the expectations of ordinary Romans. The res publica, the thing belonging to all, had been remade the property of one man. Augustus Caesar, his adopted son, would later consolidate imperial power, establishing the Pax Romana and ending the bloodshed that had plagued Rome's late republic. But this peace came at a steep price. Rome's unprecedented territorial holdings were maintained by a vast military machine, which in turn required unprecedented taxation. And as provincial governors pocketed tidy sums for themselves, senators and equestrians looked elsewhere for profit, pillaging Rome's provinces, exploiting local populations, transforming Roman elites into a predatory class of conquerors. All the while, the Roman people watched the republic they once celebrated become the empire they lived under. From the lofty ideals of the Founding Fathers to the blood-soaked streets of the late Republic, Rome had changed beyond recognition. Power had consolidated into the hands of a few, and the lives of ordinary Romans were increasingly precarious. With the assassination of Caesar, the Republic died. Augustus may have ushered in an era of stability, but he also ushered in an era of inequality. Rome had gone from a city-state to an empire, but at what cost? The Republic, with its emphasis on civic duty, equality, and the common good, was gone, replaced by a new order built on conquest, exploitation, and control. Yet amidst the intrigue and bloodshed, amidst the rise of kings and dictators, there remained a flicker of that original spirit, the res publica. In its place was the Pax Romana, a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity, during which the arts flourished, trade thrived, and the seeds of Christianity took root. Rome may have changed, but it adapted. It survived. Its story, whether told by historians or Hollywood, continues to captivate us today. But you don't have to just passively watch. You can actively participate in bringing history to life. Hey there. Hope you enjoyed our journey through the Roman Republic. Remember, every like and comment fuels our quest to bring more historical tales to life. So if you'd like to join the adventure, hit that like button and let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for coming along on this journey through time. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking questions. Together, we can explore the past and understand the present like never before. Centuries after the Republic's founding, Rome's story was not one of conquest, but of defense. A defensive expansion so relentless, so determined, that by the time Rome realized it had become the master of Italy, it had already passed the point of return. The 5th and 4th centuries BCE were centuries of war, nearly uninterrupted. The Latin League, the Valsae, the Aqui, the Sabines, Rome fought them all. Sometimes winning, often losing, but always returning to the field. These were not glorious wars in marble. They were brutal, muddy, and slow. The Roman soldier of this age was not a professional. He was a farmer with a spear who marched for seasons, then came home to rebuild whatever the enemy had burned. He fought because to not fight meant extinction. But if one enemy defined Rome's adolescence, it was the Samnites. The Samnites were a fierce mountain people of central Italy, tough, tribal, and mobile. They did not fight like the Greeks or the early Latins. They fought in ambush in ravines, in broken terrain that confused Roman formations. From 343 to 290 BCE, Rome and the Samnites clashed in 3 epic wars. At times, Rome seemed poised for dominance, at others, for ruin. The most infamous of these moments came at the Battle of the Caudine Forks, where an entire Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass and forced to surrender without a fight. The humiliation was total. Roman soldiers were made to pass under a symbolic yoke of submission, bent and unarmed. In the Forum, when news reached the Senate, silence fell. And yet the Republic endured. The Romans did what they always did. They reorganized. They trained. They swore vengeance not in rage, but in quiet determination. And by the end of the Samnite Wars, Rome had not only survived, but expanded. The lessons Rome learned from the Samnites shaped its military forever. The old phalanx, a tight square of spears borrowed from the Greeks, was abandoned in favor of the more flexible manipular legion, dated into units that could fight independently in rugged terrain. Roman roads were built not for trade but for troops. Forts became colonies, and colonies became footholds. Rome's method of spreading was not through declaration, through infrastructure. After the Samnites, more enemies appeared. The Etruscans to the north, ancient, aristocratic, and once dominant, fell one by one. To the south, the Greeks of Magna Graecia, whose cities dotted the coast, bristled at Roman encroachment. When Rome clashed with the city of Tarentum, it wasn't just a local fight. Tarentum called in a foreign savior, Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek king, cousin to Alexander the Great, and one of the most skilled generals of the age. In 280 BCE, Pyrrhus landed in Italy with war elephants, Macedonian phalanxes, and dreams of carving out his own Western Empire. He defeated the Romans at Heraclea, again at Asculum. But victory came at such a cost that it coined a term still used today: Pyrrhic victory. Rome, for all its losses, refused to quit. It absorbed the blows and responded with another army, and then another. Eventually, Pyrrhus left Italy, muttering that one more such victory would ruin him. Rome had won again, not by brilliance, but by will. By 275 BCE, Rome had conquered or allied with nearly all of the Italian peninsula. But this expansion was not merely military, it was legal. Rome developed systems to integrate the conquered. Some cities were granted civitas, signed suffragio citizenship without voting rights. Others retained self-government, but pledged loyalty, troops, and taxes. This mosaic of relationships allowed Rome to pull resources from all corners of Italy, building a machine of war unlike anything in the ancient world. But this expansion came with a cost. Veterans returned to find their farms neglected, debts mounting. Land increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy elites. Social unrest brewed under the surface. And just beyond Italy's shores lay an adversary that would bring Rome face to face with its destiny. Across the narrow sea, on the island of Sicily, another power had been growing: Carthage. A wealthy, maritime empire born of Phoenician traders. Carthage controlled parts of Spain, North Africa, and the Western Mediterranean. It was not a land power, it was a sea power, rich, proud, and dismissive of Rome. But their interests would collide. It began with a local dispute. A mercenary group called the Mamertines seized the city of Messina in Sicily and asked both Carthage and Rome for help. Carthage responded first. Rome hesitated, then intervened. That single decision triggered the First Punic War, a 23-year struggle that would transform Rome from an Italian power into a Mediterranean one. But that is a story for another night. For now, know this: the enemies that once circled Rome's gates were gone. Not because they had disappeared, but because they had been absorbed, defeated, or broken. And Rome's unity, its infrastructure, its legal cunning, and its ruthless pragmatism had forged a state that was no longer merely defending itself, it was expanding, always outward, always hungry, but every gate open to let Rome out. Also risked letting something else in. Rome had defeated its enemies, absorbed their lands, and emerged from its Italian cradle as a force to be reckoned with, in peacetime. The most dangerous enemies are often not the ones outside the gates, but the ones seated at your own table. Rome's greatest challenge now was not war, but inequality. With conquests came wealth, but not all Romans shared in the spoils. While senators enriched themselves with land, slaves, and provincial contracts, the common Roman, the very citizen, who fought in those wars, began to feel the weight of a republic drifting from its values. It began with the land. As Rome expanded, more and more soldiers were conscripted from smallholding farmers, citizens who left their fields to fight. In their absence, their farms withered or were seized. When they returned, many found themselves bankrupt or displaced. Wealthy senators and patricians, flush with war booty, bought up these abandoned properties and turned them into latifondiavaste, estates worked by slaves captured during Rome's conquests. These estates produced grain, olive oil, and wine more cheaply than any independent farmer could compete with. The result? A slow but steady death of the Roman smallholder. The plebs, once the proud backbone of the army and society, were now crowding into Rome's urban center, jobless, landless, and bitter. They had won Rome's wars, but they were losing the peace. To prevent revolt, the Senate devised a compromise: grain doles. The government would provide cheap or even free grain to poor citizens, easing their burden and keeping them fed. Over time, this system would become entrenched, a permanent state subsidy for the plebeian masses. But with free bread came another Roman invention: free entertainment. The ludi, public games, became Rome's great distraction. Chariot races and the Circus Maximus, theatrical performances, gladiatorial matches, animal hunts. Funded by the state or by wealthy politicians seeking favor, these spectacles offered a temporary escape from hardship. Bloodshed and pageantry replaced political agency. The people, once vocal and engaged, were slowly pacified. As the satirist Juvenal would later write, "Give them bread and circuses, and they will never revolt." But not everyone was willing to accept this trade. Some still believed the Republic could be reformed. Enter the Gracchi brothers in 133 BCE. Tiberius Gracchus, a patrician by birth, but tribune by election, proposed sweeping land reforms. He argued that public lands seized in wars should be redistributed to the poor, especially veterans. His plan bypassed the Senate, appealing directly to the concilium plebis, the people's assembly. It was radical. Why? Where fair alarm? Well, why, and it was dangerous. The Senate, seeing a threat to their wealth and their power, responded with fury. Public assembly. Tiberius was clubbed to death by a mob of senators and their followers. His body was thrown into the Tiber. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus took up the cause. He proposed even more ambitious reforms: fixed grain prices, military supply oversight, colonies for the poor, and the extension of citizenship to Italian allies. His eloquence, passion, and sweeping vision made him beloved by the masses and hated by the elite. Once again, violence won. Senatus Consultum Ultimate, the final decree of the Senate. Essentially, martial law was declared. Gaius was hunted through the streets of Rome and eventually died by suicide. His supporters were massacred. The Gracchi had tried to rescue the Republic through reform. Instead, they revealed its fragility. The Senate had shown it would kill its own citizens to preserve power. People had learned that votes alone were not enough. Blood had entered the forum, and it would not leave easily in the years that followed. Rome's internal divisions deepened. Political life became more theatrical, more personal, more brutal. Ambitious men began bypassing traditional routes to power, appealing directly to the masses or leveraging private armies. Rome's provinces, meanwhile, became playgrounds for exploitation. Governors, often former consuls or praetors, arrived with a single goal: to loot. With little oversight and near total authority, these men siphoned wealth, raised taxes, and brutalized locals. Corruption became not the exception, but the expectation. And yet in Rome itself, the Republic still clung to its rituals. Elections were still held. Magistrates still wore their togas. Laws were still passed. But the spirit was fading. Power now belonged less to institutions and more to personalities. Into this vacuum stepped a new kind of Roman. The populist politicians who claimed to champion the people, but often for personal gain. Opposing them were the optimates, the conservative aristocracy. Defenders of the old order, increasingly reactionary and disconnected. And then there were the soldiers. Rome's legions were evolving. Once they had been citizen armies, raised for short campaigns, loyal to the Republic. But wars now stretched across years and continents. Soldiers spent their lives in the provinces, cut off from home, reliant not on the Senate, but on their generals for pay, for plunder, for retirement land. Their loyalty shifted from Roma to the man who led them. This shift was seismic. It meant that the man with the army could defy the Senate, dictate terms, and march on Rome itself if he so chose. And one man would. His name was Gaius Marius. A self-made man from outside the aristocracy, Marius rose to consul an unprecedented 7 times. He reformed the army, allowing the landless poor to enlist, a move that filled the ranks but fundamentally changed Roman military culture. Soldiers were now professional, full-time, and loyal to their commanders, not the state. Marius also offered them retirement land, a promise that tethered their futures to his fortunes. The consequences would be enormous. After Marius came Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician general who despised Marius and the populares. Their rivalry erupted into civil war, the first time in Roman history that Roman legions fought Roman legions on Roman soil. Sulla would eventually march on Rome, not once, but twice. He declared himself dictator without term limited, unleashed a reign of terror, executing hundreds of political enemies, rewriting laws, and stacking the Senate with loyalists. Though he would eventually retire, claiming he had restored the Republic, the precedent was set. If you had the army, you had the power. Not law, not tradition, not elections, but steel. As Rome's provinces bled and its cities festered, the Republic staggered on. Still breathing, but no longer living. The question was no longer if the Republic would fall, but when and to whom. When Rome entered the final century of its Republic, the shadows of ambition had already begun to stretch long across the Forum. The Senate still met, debated, still pretended to govern. But real power now lay in the hands of generals, whose swords could silence dissent more effectively than any veto. And into this volatile world stepped a man who would change history, not through destruction, but through seduction. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and from the moment he entered public life, he played the game of power with unmatched elegance. Born in 100 BCE into the ancient but fading Julian clan, Caesar's nobility was undeniable, but his wealth was modest. His family traced its lineage to Aeneas, the Trojan hero, and claimed divine descent from Venus herself. But bloodlines could not pay debts, and Caesar's youth was marked by strategic alliances, charm, and an ability to speak to every class in Rome. He was a populist with patrician. Blood a combination both alluring and dangerous as a young man. Caesar aligned himself with the populares faction, championing the rights of the common people. He married into powerful families, gave dazzling orations, and staged grand public games. Funded not by fortune but by staggering debt, the Roman elite sneered at him, calling him vain, theatrical, and dangerous, but the people adored him. And in Rome, adoration could be leveraged like currency. After a successful stint as a military officer in Asia Minor and Hispania, Caesar returned to Rome with a reputation for both bravery and generosity. He was elected consul in 59 BC, highest office, and immediately began pushing reforms designed to help the poor and reduce the power of the Senate. But Caesar was no idealist. He was building something bigger, a political machine. To do that, he needed allies, and so he formed the first triumvirate, unofficial alliance with 2 of Rome's most powerful men, Pompey Magnus, the brilliant general who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and conquered the East. It's Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome who had crushed Spartacus's slave revolt. Together, the three men could override the Senate, pass legislation, and divide power among themselves. Each brought something unique. Caesar his popularity, Pompey his legions, Crassus his gold dot as consul. Caesar rammed through laws favorable to both Pompey and Crassus. Then, at the end of his term, he secured a 5-year proconsulship in Gaul, vast region of forests, tribes, and opportunity. It was in Gaul that Caesar would make himself a legend. The Gallic Wars, from 58 to 50 BCE, were a brutal, brilliant campaign. Caesar did not merely conquer tribes, he reshaped the map of Europe, crossed rivers once thought uncrossable, built bridges in days, and defeated vast coalitions of Gallic warriors. His enemy Vercingetorix, a charismatic chieftain, nearly united the tribes but was ultimately crushed at Alesia. Siege so tactically daring that it is still studied by generals today. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars written in the third person were dispatched back to Rome, where they were eagerly read. His fame soared, his coffers filled, his legions became fiercely loyal not to Rome, but to him. But back in Rome, the political balance was shifting. Crassus had died. During a disastrous campaign in Parthia, his army annihilated. Pompey, alarmed by Caesar's growing power, distanced himself from his old ally and aligned with the Senate. The first triumvirate collapsed, and Caesar was left alone, far from Rome, with an army that adored him and enemies preparing to strip him of command. The Senate, under Pompey's influence, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a challenge when no general before him had dared defy. But Caesar understood the stakes. On January 10th, 49 BCE, he led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy. It was an act of treason as he crossed. He is said to have uttered the words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. Civil war had begun. Rome braced for impact. Pompey fled to the east, raising an army in Greece. The Senate followed him. Caesar entered Rome unopposed. He treated the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator offering clemency to his enemies, stability to the people, control to no one but himself. Then he pursued Pompey at Pharsalus. In 48 BCE, Caesar's outnumbered forces met Pompey's. Legions in battle, against expectation, Caesar won decisively. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was betrayed and murdered upon arrival. Caesar followed on, there encountered Cleopatra VII, the young queen of Egypt, embroiled in her own dynastic struggle. Their affair was swift, scandalous, and deeply political. With Caesar's help, Cleopatra secured her throne. Caesar, in turn, fathered a son Caesarion and returned to Rome more powerful than ever. He was hailed as dictator, granted unprecedented honors, and began reshaping Rome itself. He reformed the calendar, established public works, expanded the Senate, and settled veterans across the provinces. He even wore the laurel crown constantly, disguising both his receding hairline and his ambition. But ambition has a scent, and the Senate could smell it. Some feared Caesar planned to make himself King Rex, the most hated word in Roman politics. Others resented his bypassing of tradition, his concentration of power, and his public rejection of republican restraint. A conspiracy began to form. Among the plotters were old enemies and old friends. Chief among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar had pardoned, promoted, and loved like a son. But Brutus believed that Caesar's rise meant the Republic's death. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar entered the theater of Pompey for a Senate meeting. As he sat, he was surrounded. Knives flashed, 23 wounds, the final. Most famous from Brutus himself, Et2, Brute. Then fall, Caesar. Caesar collapsed beneath the statue of Pompey, his rival, blood pooling beneath the symbol of the republic he had eclipsed. The deed was done, but the republic was not saved. It was now bleeding, leaderless, and adrift in chaos. When Rome entered the final century of its republic, shadows of ambition had already begun to stretch long across the Forum. The Senate still met, still debated, still pretended to govern. But real power now lay in the hands of generals, whose swords could silence dissent more effectively than any veto. And into this volatile world stepped a man who would change history not through destruction, but through seduction. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and from the moment he entered public life, played the game of power with unmatched elegance. Born in 100 BCE into the ancient but fading Julian clan, Caesar's nobility was undeniable, but his wealth was modest. His family traced its lineage to Aeneas, the Trojan hero, and claimed divine descent from Venus herself. But bloodlines could not pay debts, and Caesar's youth was marked by strategic alliances, charm, and an ability to speak to every class in Rome. He was a populist with patrician blood, a combination both alluring and dangerous. As a young man, Caesar aligned himself with the populares faction, championing the rights of the common people. He married into powerful families, gave dazzling orations, and staged grand public games, funded not by fortune, but by staggering debt. The Roman elite sneered at him, calling him vain, theatrical, and dangerous, but the people adored him. And in Rome, adoration could be leveraged like currency. After a successful stint as a military officer in Asia Minor and Hispania, Caesar returned to Rome with a reputation for both bravery and generosity. He was elected consul in 59 BC, Rome's highest office, and immediately began pushing reforms designed to help the poor and reduce the power of the Senate. But Caesar was no idealist. He was building something bigger, a political machine. To do that, he needed allies, and so he formed the first triumvirate, an unofficial alliance, with two of Rome's most powerful men, Pompey Magnus, the brilliant general who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and conquered the East, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, who had crushed Spartacus's slave revolt. Together, the three men could override the Senate, pass legislation, and divide power among themselves. Each brought something unique: Caesar his popularity, Pompey his legions, Crassus his gold. As consul, Caesar rammed through laws favorable to both Pompey and Crassus. Then, at the end of his term, he secured a 5-year proconsulship in Gaula, vast region of forests, tribes, and opportunity. It was in Gaul that Caesar would make himself a legend. The Gallic Wars, from 58 to 50 BCE, were a brutal, brilliant campaign. Caesar did not merely conquer tribes, he reshaped the map of Europe, crossed rivers once thought uncrossable, built bridges in days, and defeated vast coalitions of Gallic warriors. His enemy, Vercingetorix, a charismatic chieftain, nearly united the tribes but was ultimately crushed at Alesia, a siege so tactically daring that it is still studied by generals today. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, written in the third person, were dispatched back to Rome, where they were eagerly read, his famed sword, his coffers filled. His legions became fiercely loyal not to Rome, but to him. But back in Rome, the political balance was shifting. Crassus had died. During a disastrous campaign in Parthia, his army annihilated. Pompey, alarmed by Caesar's growing power, distanced himself from his old ally and aligned with the Senate. The first triumvirate collapsed, and Caesar was left alone, far from Rome, with an army that adored him and enemies preparing to strip him of command. The Senate, under Pompey's influence, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a challenge one no general before him had dared defy, but Caesar understood the stakes. On January 10th, 49 BCE, he led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy. It was an act of treason. As he crossed, he is said to have uttered the words, "Alia iacta iste," the die is cast. Civil war had begun. Rome braced for impact. Pompey fled to the east, raising an army in Greece. The Senate followed him. Caesar entered Rome unopposed. He treated the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, offering clemency to his enemies, stability to the people, and control to no one but himself. Then he pursued Pompey at Pharsalus, in 48 BCE. Caesar's outnumbered forces met Pompey's. Legions in battle, against expectation, Caesar won decisively. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was betrayed and murdered upon arrival. Caesar followed and there encountered Cleopatra VII, the young queen of Egypt, embroiled in her own dynastic struggle. Their affair was swift, scandalous, and deeply political. With Caesar's help, Cleopatra secured her throne. Caesar, in turn, father to son Caesarion and returned to Rome more powerful than ever. He was hailed as a dictator, granted unprecedented honors, and began reshaping Rome itself. He reformed the calendar, established public works, expanded the Senate, and settled veterans across the provinces. He even wore the laurel crown constantly, disguising both his receding hairline and his ambition. But ambition has a scent, and the Senate could smell it. Some feared Caesar planned to make himself King Rex, the most hated word in Roman politics. Others resented his bypassing of tradition, his concentration of power, and his public rejection of republican restraint. A conspiracy began to form. Among the plotters were old enemies and old friends. Chief among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar had pardoned, promoted, and loved like a son. But Brutus believed that Caesar's rise meant the Republic's death. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar entered the theater of Pompey for a Senate meeting. As he sat, he was surrounded. Knives flashed. 23 wounds. Oh, the final. Most famous, from Brutus himself. Et tu, Brute. Then fall, Caesar. Caesar collapsed beneath the statue of Pompey, his rival. Blood pooling beneath a symbol of the republic he had eclipsed. The deed was done, but the republic was not saved. It was now bleeding, leaderless, and adrift in chaos. The death of Caesar was meant to restore the republic. That was the hope, the justification. Even for the conspirators who bathed their daggers in the blood of the most powerful man Rome had ever known. But in killing Caesar, they had not revived liberty. They had only unchained chaos. Rome awoke on the Ides of March to rumors, silence, and fear. Crowds swelled outside the Curia, the Senate House, asking questions no one could answer. Who rules now? What happens next? The assassins had no plan. They had imagined a grateful Senate, a cheering crowd, a swift return to the orderly days of Republican governance. What they found instead was panic. The people mourned Caesar. After all, he had brought stability, wealth, and grain. To them, he was not a tyrant, but a provider. His funeral would become the turning point. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and co-consul, seized the moment. At Caesar's public funeral, he held aloft the blood-stained toga, pointing to each of the 23 wounds. He read Caesar's will aloud. Gifts of money and land for the Roman people. The crowd erupted. Grief turned to fury. The assassins fled Rome, hunted not by law, but by the vengeance of the masses. The vacuum of power had not brought balance. It had birthed another civil war. And into this storm stepped a new player, young, calculating, and underestimated. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew, a teenager with little battlefield experience but a sharp political mind. In Caesar's will, he was adopted posthumously and named heir. Gaius Julius, Caesar, Octavianus, or simply Octavian, I had inherited. Not just a name, but a legacy, a network, and the loyalty of Caesar's veterans. Mark Antony dismissed him. The Senate used him, but Octavian moved with quiet brilliance. He raised legions with his own funds, marched on Rome, and forced the Senate to recognize him. He was 19. And he was just getting started. In 43 BCE, Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's former ally, formed the second triumvirate. Unlike the first, this one was official, legal, and backed by military force. It was also bloody. Their first act was the proscriptions, a list of enemies of the state to be executed, their property seized. Thousands died, including Cicero, the great orator and philosopher who had tried to steer Rome back to republican ideals. His hands and head were nailed to the rostra and the forum a warning to all. With Rome purged, the triumvirs turned east to confront the last of Caesar's murderers. At Philippi in 42 BCE, the forces of Brutus and Cassius met those of Antony and Octavian. The battle was brutal, chaotic, and final. Cassius died by suicide, mistakenly believing Brutus had lost. Brutus followed soon after. The Republic, in any practical sense, had died with them, but peace did not follow. The triumvirate fractured. Lepidus was sidelined, sent into quiet exile. Antony, now ruling the East, fell under the spell of Cleopatra. Their union, both romantic. In political alarmed Rome, Antony divorced Octavian's sister. He began adopting Egyptian customs, issuing declarations from Alexandria, presenting Caesarion, his son by Cleopatra, as Caesar's true heir. Octavian saw the opening. He launched a propaganda war, portraying Antony as a traitor seduced by a foreign queen. He read Antony's will aloud to the Senate, revealing plans to leave Roman land to Cleopatra's children. The Senate was outraged. War was declared in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra's forces. The lovers fled to Egypt. A year later, as Octavian approached, they both died by suicide. Cleopatra famously by ass bite, Antony by sword. Octavian entered Alexandria unopposed. He conquered not just a rival, but a myth. In 27 BCE, the Senate granted him a new title, Augustus. He accepted modestly, pretending to restore the Republic, while in truth, he secured complete control. He would rule for over 4 decades, never wearing a crown, never declaring himself king, yet wielding more power than any were men before him. The Republic had fallen. Twice. Once when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and again when Augustus refused. To give power back, Rome would never be the same, and the world would. Remember their names? Julius, Brutus, Antony, Cleopatra, Augustus. The Republic was dead, but the empire had been born. With Augustus now at the helm, Rome exhaled. The chaos of civil war faded like a bad dream, replaced by order, administration, and ceremony. Augustus, ever the master of perception, understood that power must be dressed in tradition. Though he ruled as an autocrat, he called himself princeps first among equals. The Senate still met. Consuls were still elected, but their authority was an illusion. Augustus held imperium, tribunician power, and control over the legions. Yet to the average Roman it felt like the Republic had simply been ... polished. This new era would be known as the Pax Romanova, Roman peace, a 200-year stretch of relative stability and prosperity. Augustus invested in infrastructure, building roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. He reformed taxation, established a professional standing army, and created the Praetorian Guard, an elite force loyal to the emperor. He promoted marriage and family, moral reform, and religious revival. He rebuilt 82 temples across Rome, not just to honor the gods, but to signal the return of divine favor. But perhaps his most powerful tool was propaganda. Poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid were patronized to write works that glorified Augustus and his regime. Virgil's Aeneid, Rome's great epic, traced the origins of the city back to Aeneas, linking Augustus to divine destiny. Statues, coins, monuments all bore his image. His reign became mythology while he still breathed. Behind the scenes, Augustus was careful. He avoided the mistakes of Caesar. He never called himself king. He avoided overt tyranny, kept his enemies close, but his power closer. Succession, however, remained a challenge. He had no surviving sons. He adopted several heirs, first his nephew Marcellus, and his friend Agrippa's sons Gaius and Lucius, all of whom died young. Eventually he settled on Tiberius, his stepson by Livia. Reluctantly, the aging princeps passed the baton. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome mourned as if a god had departed. And in truth, the Senate declared him one. Augustus became Divus Augustus, the divine founder of the empire. Tiberius would succeed him, but the mold was set. Rome was no longer a republic in anything but name. It was an empire, wrapped in laurels. An illusion, watched over by emperors, guarded by swords, and the people, they still had their bread and their circuses. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, the fires of civil war at last extinguished. Gaius Octavius, now styled Augustus, returned to Rome not merely as a victor, but as the most powerful man in the known world. The gates of Janus, the temple, whose doors were opened only in times of war, were closed for the first time in a generation. After years of chaos, bloodshed, and political betrayal, Rome stood quiet. But Augustus understood what his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, had not. Power without subtlety invites daggers. He had no intention of following Caesar's bloody path to the Senate floor. No crown would rest on his brow. No titles that reeked of monarchy would pass his lips. Instead, he would rule in disguise, first among equals, the princeps senatus. The first citizen, the republic, in name, would continue. Its soul, however, would now live in a gilded cage. It began slowly. Augustus offered to resign all his powers in 27 BCE, an act of feigned humility that prompted the Senate, deeply grateful, or perhaps simply afraid, to beg him to stay. In return, they granted him imperium mais, supreme command over all the armies of Rome, and the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was a new name for a new order. He never claimed to be a king. Instead, he became tribune for life. Protector of the plebs was Pontifex Maximus, head of religion. He took control of the treasury, the courts, the military, the grain supply. He appointed governors to provinces. He oversaw the Senate through every gesture. He insisted he was merely restoring tradition. Rome, ever pragmatic, accepted the illusion. And why wouldn't it? After all, Augustus brought stability. Under his steady hand, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, began a 200-year period of relative tranquility across the empire. 8 roads stretched from the deserts of Syria to the misty forests of Germania. Trade flourished. Cities grew. Taxes were predictable. The army, loyal and well-paid, defended Rome's borders with discipline. It was not freedom, but it was order. Augustus ruled with caution and tact. He avoided flamboyance. He dressed modestly. He lived simply, or so it appeared. He understood the power of performance. Publicly, he restored temples, funded games, celebrated Roman values. Privately, he reorganized the bureaucracy, ensured loyalty through patronage, and planted spies in every corridor of power. One of his greatest tools was image. Through poets, sculptors, and architects, he shaped a version of himself that was eternal. Virgil, Rome's greatest poet, penned the Aeneid under Augustus's patronage, a mythic tale linking Rome's origins to heroic Troy. In painting Augustus as the fulfillment of destiny, statues of the emperor portrayed him eternally youthful, serene, and God-touched. Temples were rededicated in his name. The city itself was reshaped. Augustus famously said that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. But beneath the marble, old tensions remained. Augustus knew that. Rome's fatal flaw had always been succession. The Republic had no mechanism for inherited rule. Concellars were elected, governors appointed. But Augustus, having concentrated all power in his person, now faced the same problem as any monarch. What would happen when he died? He tried to craft a dynasty. He adopted his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, grooming them for leadership. But both died young, carried off by illness. His stepson Tiberius, a dour and reluctant figure, became the next candidate. Augustus adopted him too, making it official. But Tiberius lacked charisma, and worse, lacked Augustus's talent for pretending not to rule. In his later years, Augustus grew more anxious. He began writing his own epitaph for his Gesta Divi Augusti. The deeds of the divine Augustus, a record of all he had done, to be carved on bronze pillars and read by generations to come. It was part autobiography, part propaganda, Confession. He wanted to ensure that history would remember him not as a tyrant, but as a savior. He also grew increasingly moralistic. Laws were passed to encourage marriage, discourage adultery, and punish extravagance. He exiled his own daughter, Julia, for scandalous behavior, an act that shocked Rome, but underscored his image as moral guardian. Augustus was no longer just ruler. He had become the father of the Roman people. In 14 CE, after over 40 years in power, Augustus died in the town of Nola. He was 75 years old. According to legend, his last words were, "Have I played my part well in the comedy of life? Then applaud as I exit." He was cremated, and his ashes placed in a grand mausoleum in Rome. The Senate declared him a god. Divus Augustus temples were built in his honor. Rome wept, or pretended to. Tiberius succeeded him, not as a dictator or king, but as princeps, just like Augustus. The curtain remained drawn. The Republic, by now only a shadow, still stood in name. And that was the genius of Augustus. He did not kill the Republic. He embalmed it. He built a golden tomb around its institutions, preserved its rituals, let the Senate still vote, and the people still cheer. But power no longer came from debate or elections. It came from a single man and the structures he controlled. Augustus had crafted an autocracy masquerading as a republic, and it worked. For now, the golden cage was beautiful marble columns, public festivals, grain doles, and grand victories. But it was still a cage. And when the keys passed to lesser men, crueler, weaker matter, the bars would begin to rattle. The Republic had died with Caesar, but it was Augustus who made sure. No one noticed. The Roman Republic was dead, embalmed within the structure of an empire that wore its skin like a costume. For over 2 centuries after Augustus's death, the illusion of stability held firm. Rome was ruled by emperors, not senators, by decree, not debate. Yet the facades remained. The Senate still met, votes were still counted. Every new emperor claimed the title princeps first among equals, even as they held absolute power. But time is a patient underminer, and beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Tiberius, the immediate heir to Augustus, ruled with quiet suspicion and reclusive paranoia. Retreated to the island of Capri, leaving governance to a ruthless praetorian named Sejanus, who ruled with cruelty and intrigue. Tiberius's death was followed by the rise of Caligula, a young man who began with promise but descended quickly into madness. Declaring himself a god and planning to make his horse a consul, the madness spread not just through emperors, but through the structure itself. Rome was no longer a city of citizens but a capital of subjects. The Senate became a rubber stamp. The people, once the engine of republican energy, became spectators in the theater of empire. Power was centralized not in institutions but in personalities, and when those personalities were cruel, careless, or insane, the empire suffered. The imperial line staggered forward. Awkward. Claudius, awkward and scholarly, brought competence but was poisoned by his wife Agrippina to make way for her son, Nero, and Nero, artist, actor, tyrant, epitomized the moral rot of the imperial system. He burned Rome, built palaces on its ashes, and executed anyone who so much as frowned in his direction. In the year 68 CE, with legions marching on the capital, Nero took his own life, crying, "What an artist dies in me." His death marked the year of the 4 emperors, a brutal cycle of civil war where generals, not laws, decided who ruled Rome. Vespasian, the victor, brought stability for a time, but the pattern had been set. Power now came from the sword. The Republic had feared standing armies loyal to individuals. Empire was built entirely upon them. The emperors who followed, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, kept the illusion alive. They were philosophers, builders, warriors. Under their rule, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the sands of Arabia to the moors of Britain. Roads, aqueducts, and laws tied the empire together like arteries in a body, but even as the limbs moved, the heart was weakening. The deeper problem was one of identity. The Republic had been an idea. It bound men together with shared stories of duty, law, and sacrifice. The empire, by contrast, was a machinery of control. It maintained peace, but not purpose. It offered order, but not inspiration. Replaced participation with obedience, and participation mattered. In the Republic, even the lowliest citizen felt they had a stake in Rome's fate through elections, debates, service, protest. In the Empire, a citizen was simply ruled. As the years turned into centuries, this passivity hollowed the core, and then came the rot. Corruption, never absent, became systemic. Governors enriched themselves. Armies were bought and sold. The Senate degenerated into sycophancy. Entire emperors were made by the Praetorian Guard, who began selling the purple throne to the highest bidder. At one point, the empire literally went to auction. By the 3rd century, Rome faced a perfect storm. Enemies pressed in from all sides: the Goths, the Persians, the Vandals. Plagues swept through the cities. Famine crippled trade. Civil wars became constant. The crisis of the 3rd century. Over 20 emperors ruled in just 50 years, most dying violently. Some ruled for mere months. Others never reached Rome. Rome, once the master of order, was becoming ungovernable. Reforms were attempted. Diocletian split the empire in two, east and west, to make administration easier. He increased the military, strengthened borders, and persecuted Christians to preserve the old Roman gods. But even he knew what was lost could not be restored. Then came Constantine, who legalized Christianity and moved the capital east to Byzantium, later called Constantinople. The center of gravity shifted. The western half, home to the Senate, the Forum, and the old soul of the Republic, began to wither, and in 476 CE, it finally collapsed. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a boy of 16, was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer. No bloodbath, no drama, just an imperial seal handed over. The Senate, asked to approve this transition, nodded along. They had been approving such things for centuries now. They had forgotten how to refuse. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would live on for nearly 1,000 years more. Rome, the idea, was dead. Not with Caesar, not with Augustus, not even with Nero, but with a quiet surrender to irrelevance. And yet, the ghost lingered. The Republic that had died centuries earlier still haunted Europe's imagination. The Renaissance looked back to Roman law and civic virtue. The American and French revolutions invoked the Senate, the Forum, the people's right to rule themselves. The eagle, the fasces, the Latin phrases, senatus, populusque, Romanus all reappeared, carved into buildings, woven into flags, because the Republic had been more than government. It had been a dream. A dream of a city where law was higher than men, where power was borrowed and never owned, where even the greatest bowed before the idea of Rome. It is a dream that flickers still, but like all ghosts, it reminds us of what was lost, what might yet be reclaimed. The empire watched itself burn not in flames of war, but in the slow erosion of meaning, and in the silence afterward, only the echoes of a republic remained. Influence would swell into authority, but no system is perfect. The Republic, for all its complexity, was vulnerable particularly to manipulation. The assemblies where Roman citizens voted were often chaotic affairs. Wealthy men could influence votes with gifts, favors, or threats. Citizens voted in centuries, not individually, meaning the elite few had disproportionate say. The laws were public, yes, but their interpretation was often private, and yet for generations this tangled system worked. Not because it was flawless, but because it was adaptable. When the plebeians demanded more rights, they got them slowly, painfully. New laws emerged: the Lex Canulea, allowing marriage between classes; the Lex Hortensia, making plebiscites binding on all citizens. Rome didn't shatter under pressure. It absorbed, adapted, and moved forward. This adaptability was mirrored in the Roman idea of citizenship. While most ancient powers subjugated conquered peoples, Rome often offered them paths to inclusion. First, Latin rights. Later, full citizenship. A Samnite today could be a Roman senator's ancestor tomorrow. This was not generosity, it was strategy. Inclusion meant loyalty, and loyalty meant empire, but it also meant complexity. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome's legal landscape had become crowded. New laws overlapped old ones. Customs clashed with codification. To resolve this, a class of legal experts, jurisconsulti, emerged. These men interpreted laws, wrote legal opinions, and helped guide courts. They became the quiet architects of Roman justice. Their influence would one day reach far beyond the Republic, into imperial codes, and even the foundations of modern law. Still, for all its innovations, Roman law was not impartial, favored the wealthy. It assumed the primacy of male citizens. Slaves, women, and foreigners occupied legal gray zones. A man could be judged by his peers. A slave could be flogged without trial. A patrician could delay a court case for months. A plebeian might lose everything in a single day, and yet even in its contradictions, the Republic clung to the idea that law, not birth, made Rome what it was. No man, not even a consul, was above it. And in times of uncertainty, Romans looked not to leaders but to precedent. They asked not who was right, but what the ancestors had done. This reverence for structure would become both the Republic's shield and its blindfold. As Rome expanded, as wars multiplied and fortunes grew, the system would strain. Powerful generals would rise. Wealth would pool in the hands of the few, and men would begin to see laws not as sacred, but as obstacles. But that would come later. For now, Rome was stable, governed not by the whims of rulers, but by the weight of law. A city bound by rituals, offices, and the ever-present memory of a time when kings ruled alone. The Republic was still young, still principled, still unsure of what it would one day become, but it had drawn a line in stone. Power must answer to law. Even if one day, law would be forced to answer to power.